Shalom, Bethel family. It's Thursday, time to review our Shabbat Torah talk from last week. Over the past few weeks, I've mostly refrained from speaking in shul about the JCC bomb threats and the defacing of Jewish cemeteries, horrible things that are occurring all across the country. I've done so for two reasons. One, over the last couple of weeks, we have had simchas in shul, and I didn't want to step on the simchas by mentioning such awful things, but also because I knew that last week would be Shabbat-Zachor. And that's the Shabbat that immediately precedes Purim, and when it is a mitzvah to remember Amalek, the spiritual clan of anti-Semites that includes Haman. See, we Jews, we can't just celebrate a redemption without focusing in on the hardships, whether it's pretending we're slaves on Passover or Shabbat-Zachor preceding Purim. We need to get into the emotional negativity before we can really celebrate the positivity. It's just what we do. So this past Shabbat, as is the custom, I wanted to talk about anti-Semitism and what's happening across the country. There are two parts to this talk, and I beg you to watch all the way till the end. The first part, about anti-Semitism, is entitled Don't Panic. And the second part, about speech in this country, is entitled Be Worried and Take Action. So let's talk Don't Panic. Look, there's no doubt that there have been a spate of anti-Semitic incidents in this country of late, and I will not be so sanguine as to posit that everything is okay or even the same as it was a few months ago. From JCC bomb threats that have real impacts on parents' psychology and preschool enrollments to horrifying desecration of Jewish cemeteries, these are disturbing times. However, I think we may be misinterpreting exactly what is going on, and I think we're doing that misinterpreting, and this should probably surprise no one, because of politics. Right, let's face it. Many of us are unnerved in general over the last few months. And though there has undoubtedly been a rise in hard right-wing anti-Semitic activity, we are kidding ourselves if we think that this is new or that it's strictly reserved to the right. The fact is that there is plenty of hard left-wing anti-Semitism and has been for a long time. This has always been the case throughout history. Anti-Semitism is not reserved for the right or the left. The Jews are targets from all extremes, and our history bears that out, as we've been persecuted by the most right-wing regimes in history and the most left-wing regimes in history. It is fair game. Extremism, in fact, tends to be a breeder of anti-Semitism. But Jews with more liberal leanings tend to be hypersensitive when a leader is elected in this country from the right. Take a Wall Street Journal headline that I found from 22 years ago. Religious fervor. Some liberal Jews, to their own surprise, see a rise in bigotry, and unlike many Orthodox, they're concerned about the right's new power. It sounds like it could be from yesterday, but it's from 22 years ago. They are increasingly uncomfortable with verbal attacks by conservative commentators on the cultural elite and on Hollywood, both of which they believe are code words for Jews. Right? This is from 22 years ago, when a new Congress swept into office on the heels of this new powerful coalition, the religious right. And similar headlines appeared when George W. Bush was elected in 2000, predicting a massive wave of anti-Semitism that I don't think ever really appeared. So how we view anti-Semitic acts is often tied to how we are feeling overall. When we are anxious about who's in power and what their beliefs may be, we tend to interpret everything in this very narrow focus of anti-Semitism and the right. And for an example, from the other side, in 2010, 3 Jews were murdered in the parking lot of the Overland Park JCC in Kansas. And anecdotally, there was less anxiety then than there is now. And that was when 3 people were murdered. I think our reactions to what is going on now is at least in part driven by politics, driven by media, and driven by social media. And therefore, I think it is wrong to panic. We should not panic now. We should be as wary as ever. We should protect, but we shouldn't panic. Yet, as I said earlier, we do need to be worried and take action. Not about anti-Semitism, but the fact that that anti-Semitic wave is tied to something different, a bigger, more important trend. I would posit that the uptick in anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic activity is part of a larger trend of hate speech and hate crimes in this country, which have been on a steady rise since well before the election. What's the cause? Not a platform of specific hate against Jews, but a platform of anti-political correctness from the right and from offices as high as now the presidency, and from the left, a campaign of anti-free speech that we saw on grand display at Middlebury College just a little over a week ago. Both this platform of anti-political correctness on the right and this platform of anti-free speech on the left are based on a general demonization of the other. Whether it's about Muslims or Mexicans or immigrants, women or political opponents, it feels like things that would have been scandalous to say or do just a year ago are now fair game. And if we think that speech like that will ever be limited to other groups, we are kidding ourselves. This works one of 2 ways in history. We know it for thousands of years already. Either the hate speech starts about Jews and then spreads to other minority groups, or the hate speech starts about other minority groups and eventually spreads to the Jews. The Jews are never left alone. Not in the Shushan of Purim, not in the Spain of Isabella and Ferdinand, or in the Europe of the 1930s and 1940s. Anyone who thinks that it's okay to say nasty things about other minorities because, well, they deserve it, and that it won't eventually spill over to the Jews, you are kidding yourself. As I've watched this trend unfold, I heard about some interesting research on one of my favorite podcasts, referenced by commentator Maria Konnikova. 2 researchers in Princeton, Susan Fisk and Betsy Levy-Palak, have done a lot of work in the area of bias. And their research shows that we all have biases, ingrained to us from a very young age, and that continue to develop under the influence of the world around us. But those biases, while they may be deep inside us, do not necessarily change how we behave. In Fisk's research, she showed, for example, that doctors who tested for the greatest inherent bias often had the best records in care that they provided for their patients. All of their patients. They were just good doctors. However, Palak's research shows that when the environment changes to make the expression of those biases more acceptable, then they present themselves in the form of action, in the form of behavior. Palak's main research on this, scarily enough, was done in Rwanda, where after the genocide there, she wanted to know how this could happen. And she found that prior to the horror, the tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis, they lived side by side in more or less peace, that they intermarried between themselves, that their biases, if present, were more or less completely restrained in their actions. So what happened to change that? A new ruler came to rule, and he stoked the embers of their bias and stoked them until they were aflame. And only then, only when there was permission to act on their bias, or seemingly so, then madness broke out and all hell broke loose. Now, I am not saying that the U.S. is going to be the next Rwanda, God forbid. I don't believe that. But I am saying that the trend of anti-Semitic acts is tied to this new permission that people feel to say awful things that come to their minds, to express their biases, And that can and will have real and lasting consequences, not only for the Jews of America, but for all minorities and for the soul of this country itself. This attack on speech, this movement against political correctness, which is really a permission to use hate speech, and this movement to negate dialogue and stop allowing free speech and stop allowing all different opinions to be heard, even if we don't like them, both of those attacks on speech are coming from either side to create an environment that is leading not only to anti-Semitic acts, but attacks on all kinds of minorities. Don't forget, while desecration of a cemetery is horrifying, while bomb threats being called to JCCs is ugly, that in the last year, no bomb threat of thousands against all different kinds of places has ever resulted in a bomb. And 400 bombings that actually took place, none of them were preceded by a threat. But meanwhile, people who look like they're of Middle Eastern descent are being shot in bars in the Midwest while people yell, "Get out of our country." This is not reserved for the Jews. And as long as we keep our focus so narrowed in on anti-Semitism, we are going to miss something much bigger and more important that is happening in this country. However, the research shows some good news too. Just as hate speech can be easily stoked, it can also be easily quelled when influential people and the media speak up and speak out. Something that was missing in Rwanda, as it was missing in Germany, and it was probably missing in Shushan too. The research of Kevin Munger, a PhD candidate at NYU, shows how effective it can be when influential people speak up. When they do, others quiet down. He designed an experiment on Twitter where he had robot accounts enter the Twitter circles of people who made racist remarks frequently. Then when a racist remark was made, the Twitter bot would call out the perpetrator, saying, "Hey man, just remember that there are real people who are hurt when you harass them with that kind of language." When the Twitter bot was representing someone the perpetrator deemed as influential, the incidence of racial slurs by that person went down. It's proof that when people of perceived influence or privilege speak up, it makes a difference. We, my friends, are people of perceived influence and privilege, and we need to act. So I think we should not be panicked about anti-Semitism, but at the same time, we should be worried about the general trend towards hate speech and towards denial of free speech that I truly believe stems from this anti-politically correct speech going all the way back to President Trump and the Oval Office, as well as to the anti-free speech movement that we saw in Middlebury a week and a half ago, and we see rear its ugly head on campuses time and again. Furthermore, as people who are generally well-connected and often influential, and with a good deal of privilege, we bear a responsibility to speak out when we hear language that belittles a group of people or speaks from bias against anyone, whether it is geared towards Jews or not. We need to do this not only because Esther learned so long ago that bias and hate will eventually fall to us, but also because it is our Jewish values that tell us it is the right thing to do. Don't panic about anti-Semitism. Be worried about the attack on speech in this country from all directions. And after we celebrated Purim, celebrated the redemption so long ago brought about by Esther and Mordecai and their willingness to speak up, let us too take action to make sure that that same redemption is available right here in this beautiful country, not only for the Jews for all time, but for all people, fulfilling the promise of what America truly is and can be. That promise is our responsibility as much as anyone's. So I wish you a happy Purim. I hope you had a wonderful holiday and a Shabbat Shalom coming up.